Frank Sullivan didn't expect his old dog to wake him up in the middle of the night. Not again. But when Duke's claws scraped on the bedroom door for the 7th time that week, sharp and urgent, Frank knew something was different this time. Something was wrong. At 67 years old, Frank wasn't exactly a spring chicken anymore. His joints creaked like an old screen door, and his nights were usually spent staring at the ceiling. Haunted by memories of his late wife Mary, but Duke's loyal German Shepherd and former police partner had been his constant companion through it all. Duke was no ordinary dog. He was a hero in his own right, having worked alongside Frank for years on the streets of Cedar Falls, Missouri. But now, Duke was slowing down. The sharp nose that once sniffed out danger 3 blocks away was dulled by age and illness. Yet tonight, Duke's amber eyes held a fire Frank hadn't seen in years. The dog's pacing was frantic, almost desperate, as if he was trying to say something urgent, but he couldn't speak. "Easy, boy," Frank croaked, his voice rough from a sleepless night. He fumbled for his glasses on the nightstand, knocking over his pill bottle. The weight of grief pressed down on him again. Mary had been gone for 2 years, and the house still felt empty, the silence only broken by Duke's restless whimpering. This wasn't just restlessness. Frank pulled on his worn jeans and a flannel shirt, the kind Mary loved, the scent of lavender detergent, faint but comforting. He didn't ask questions. Duke was leading, and he was going to follow. Outside, the October air was crisp and still. The small town of Cedar Falls was asleep, the porch lights casting soft halos on empty sidewalks. This was the kind of place where neighbors still left, their doors unlocked. And kids rode bikes without helmets, a small slice of Americana, where everyone knew your name. But tonight, that peace felt fragile. Duke's limp was worse than yesterday. His big paws pounded the cracked pavement as he led Frank through the quiet streets, his breath heavy but steady. The dog's pace was purposeful, unwavering. Drawing Frank toward the edge of town to the old Cedar Falls food processing plant, Frank had passed that sprawling concrete complex 1,000 times over his 30 years as a cop. He knew the place well enough to consider it harmless. Baby food, cereals, crackers, they made the staples for families around here. Nothing sinister, but Duke saw something Frank couldn't. At the chain-link fence surrounding the plant, Duke pressed his nose against the cold metal and whimpered, scratching at the ground like he was trying to dig to the other side of the world. His gums were pale, his body trembling. Frank's heart clenched. Something was very wrong. The trucks parked along the loading dock looked normal in 3 big 18-wheelers with humming refrigerated trailers. Workers in white coveralls moving with practiced efficiency. The only odd thing was the huge banner stretched across the loading bay. Cedar Falls Harvest Festival, 3 days away. 10,000 free family samples ready for distribution. 10,000 boxes, 10,000 families. 10,000 children about to eat whatever was packed inside those boxes. Frank's mind flashed to his neighbors, the Hendersons, with their twin toddlers. To the parents who would bring their kids to that festival, trusting the food was safe. He looked down at Duke, whose body shuddered as he convulsed. Legs buckling beneath him, the dog vomited, blood-tinged foam splattering on the asphalt. Frank dropped to his knees, chest tightening with a mix of fear and helplessness. "Jesus, Duke, what's happening to you?" he whispered, cradling the dog's head. Duke looked up, eyes glassy but fierce, full of something Frank couldn't name. A warning, a message. The memories crashed back like a tidal wave of a warehouse in Kansas City, a near-death moment that had nearly broken them both. Of nights when Frank's hands shook from trauma, when Mary had whispered about poison in children, and how sorry she was for not being stronger, a laugh drifted from a nearby park where early joggers were gathering, their footsteps light and carefree. Unaware of the darkness creeping toward their community, Frank held Duke close, his voice breaking. "Let's get you home, boy." But as they walked away, Duke kept looking back. Whining with a desperate urgency, Frank didn't understand Dot at the porch of his modest home. Frank sat with Duke's head in his lap, watching the sky turn from black, 2 shades of gold and pink. The dawn Mary had always called a second chance. "Trust your gut, buddy," Frank murmured, using the nickname only Mary had been allowed to call him. "You've never been wrong before." Reaching for his phone, Frank scrolled to Dr. Margaret Winter's number. Maggie was Mary's best friend and the only vet within miles who truly understood what Duke had been through. The line rang twice. Before Maggie answered, her voice thick with sleep. "Frank, it's 6 in the morning. Is Duke okay?" Frank looked down at his dog, whose breathing was shallow, coat dull, but eyes still burning with that familiar, desperate intelligence. "No, Maggie. I don't think he is. And whatever's wrong with Duke, I think it's bigger than just him." Mid-story, YouTube call to subscribe if you love stories about the incredible bond between humans and animals, and heroic tales like Duke's. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our community at Heroes for Animals. We bring you real stories that touch the heart and show the power of loyalty and love. Back at the vet's clinic, the antiseptic smell mingled with Frank's growing dread. Maggie's experienced hands checked Duke's vital signs, her frown deepening with every test. "This isn't just old age, Frank," she said gently but firmly. "Duke's showing signs of chronic heavy metal poisoning. Chemicals, probably industrial, slowly poisoning him over time." Frank's stomach dropped. "How long has he been exposed?" "Could be weeks, could be months, but it's ongoing. Something's out there, Frank, and Duke's been close to it." The thought hit Frank hard. Duke's nightly trips to that factory couldn't be a coincidence. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young woman stepped inside, a city reporter from Kansas City, Sarah Chen Murphy. Her sharp eyes and determined stance told Frank she wasn't here for small talk. "I'm investigating cases of trauma and paranoia in elderly veterans," she said, flashing her press badge. "Frank Sullivan, right?" Frank's old cop instincts tightened. "Depends who's asking." Sarah smiled, but her tone was serious. "Several people in town say you've been acting strange. Hanging around that food plant at all hours, making wild claims." Frank bristled. "Wild claims. Duke's been trying to tell me something, and I'm not the crazy one here." Sarah softened. "If there's even a chance you're right, the community deserves to know, especially with that festival coming up." Frank looked out the window toward the factory's glowing lights, Duke's restless eyes reflecting his own fears. The countdown was on. The sun was just starting to creep over the horizon, casting a soft orange glow across Cedar Falls. The quiet streets that had felt so peaceful only hours before now held an uneasy tension in the early morning light. Frank Sullivan's mind raced as he drove Duke to Dr. Margaret Winter's veterinary clinic. The old dog lay beside him in the passenger seat, barely moving, his breathing shallow and labored. Frank had been a cop for more than 3 decades, and there weren't many things that could rattle him anymore. But this was something else, something he couldn't ignore. At the clinic, Maggie greeted them with worry etched deep into her face. She'd been Mary's best friend for years, and understood the bond between Frank and Duke better than anyone else. As Frank carried the trembling dog inside, he felt a lump form in his throat. "Frank," Maggie said quietly, setting down her coffee, "he looks worse than I thought." Frank nodded, his voice tight. "I don't know what's wrong with him, Maggie, but I'm scared." Maggie helped Frank onto a cold metal exam table, her hands gentle but firm as she began a thorough checkup. She pressed on Duke's gums. They were pale, almost white. She listened carefully to his heartbeat, which was weak and irregular. "This isn't just old age catching up to him," Maggie said, her brow furrowed. "His temperature's elevated and his liver feels swollen. Frank, I'm worried he's been exposed to some kind of poison." Frank's stomach dropped like a rock. "Poison? How? What kind?" Maggie shook her head. "That's what we need to find out. I'm going to run a full toxicology panel, but from what I'm seeing, it looks like chronic exposure to something heavy. Metals, industrial chemicals, maybe." Frank felt the weight of those words settle on his chest. Chronic, long-term exposure. "Do you think it's from the plant?" he asked quietly. "I don't know for sure yet," Maggie admitted, "but it's definitely possible. Duke's been going there night after night. If there's anything toxic in the air or the ground, he's been breathing it in, licking it up, living with it every day." Frank's mind flashed back to Duke's desperate pacing at the fence, the way he kept trying to dig under it, to get to something Frank couldn't see after the exam. Maggie drew blood and prepared the samples for testing. She looked at Frank with a seriousness that left no room for doubt. "If what I think is true, Duke's got a fight ahead of him, but I'll do everything I can." Frank swallowed hard and squeezed Duke's paw. "You're a fighter, buddy, just like me." Outside the clinic, the world was waking up. The first buses rumbled down Main Street, farmers began loading their trucks, and neighbors greeted one another with nods and waves. But Frank's small corner of the world felt different. He was looking at the town with fresh eyes, wary eyes. That afternoon, Frank sat on his front porch, Duke resting in the shade nearby. The phone rang and startled him from his thoughts. It was Sarah Chen Murphy, the reporter from Kansas City. "I've been digging into some things," Sarah said without preamble. "I think you might be onto something bigger than you realize." Frank leaned forward, curiosity piqued despite the weariness clinging to him. "I looked into the Cedar Falls food processing plant," Sarah continued. "You're right, something's off." "What do you mean?" Frank asked, already knowing the answer but wanting to hear it from someone else. "There have been complaints about the plant's safety practices, mostly swept under the rug," Sarah said, "and some of the workers have gotten sick. I found records of chemical spills, unexplained illnesses." Frank rubbed his forehead. "And the food, the festival. That's the problem," Sarah said grimly. "They're planning to distribute tens of thousands of food samples to families all over town. If there's contamination, it could be catastrophic." Frank felt his heart pound. "Duke's been trying to warn us. I just hope we've got time." Meanwhile, Duke's condition was worsening. His eyes remained sharp, still burning with that old police dog intensity. Maggie came by Frank's house later that day with the test results. She laid the papers on the kitchen table, her expression heavy. "It's bad, Frank," she said. "High levels of lead, mercury, and other heavy metals. Duke's been exposed to a cocktail of toxins over time." Frank's jaw clenched. "How does this happen?" "In industrial areas, it can come from faulty waste disposal, contaminated water, or unsafe chemicals stored improperly. And if it's in the food supply, ... Maggie's voice trailed off. Frank looked at Duke, who lifted his head weakly and gave a soft whimper. "We have to stop it, Maggie," Frank said firmly. Before it's too late. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. His mind was a tangle of memories and fears. He thought about Mary and her quiet suspicions before she died, about the way Duke had led him to that plant, night after night, about the families who would trust that food. He thought about the Harvest Festival, just 3 days away, the event where 10,000 free boxes of food would be handed out to children. Parents, neighbors. His phone buzzed again. "It was Sarah. I'm coming your way," she said. "We need to figure this out together." When Sarah arrived, she brought with her an energy that cut through Frank's exhaustion. She had bags full of files, notes, and a laptop loaded with interviews and documents. "We've been talking to some of the workers," Sarah said. "They're scared. They've seen things, chemical leaks, boxes being tampered with, but nobody's listening." Frank shook his head. "We have to find proof." Sarah nodded. "I'm working on it." Together, they pored over maps, documents, and reports late into the night. The next morning, Frank met with Maggie again, who brought in an expert from the State Environmental Agency. The expert's words were blunt and chilling. "Suspect is true," the expert said. "This could affect not just Cedar Falls, but the surrounding counties. Heavy metals can cause serious health issues, especially in children." Frank's fists clenched. "That festival, ... "Yes," the expert said quietly. "The timing couldn't be worse. We're going to stop this." Meanwhile, in the shadows, someone was watching Frank's every move. The man in charge of the Cedar Falls food processing plant, Billy Hartwell, had noticed the old cop's sudden interest. The polished businessman, who had once been a lost teenager, now ran the biggest employer in town. And he wasn't about to let anyone threaten his empire. But even Billy hadn't expected Duke, an old dog who refused to back down. Frank Sullivan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the papers spread before him. His hands trembled slightly, partly from exhaustion, partly from the weight of everything pressing down on him. The toxicology reports, the environmental assessments, Sarah's growing pile of notes, it all painted a grim picture. But what pained him most was the gnawing feeling that no one in Cedar Falls wanted to believe him. That morning, Frank had made several calls to local officials, the police chief, and even the mayor's office. The response was the same everywhere: cautious, skeptical, distant. "Without concrete proof," they said. "It's just rumors." We can't shut down the biggest event of the year on hearsay. And worst of all, some quietly suggested Frank might be suffering from grief and paranoia, the kind that clung to you when you lost someone dear. The whispers were already starting in town. People who once nodded politely at Frank now exchanged sideways glances. Old Man Sullivan's lost it, some said, talking nonsense about poison and conspiracies. Frank wasn't used to being doubted, especially after a career spent protecting his community. But this felt different. This wasn't about him. This was about Duke Hand, about the families who trusted those free food boxes. As Frank rubbed his weary eyes, it was Sarah Chen Murphy, the young reporter who had become his unlikely ally. Frank, her voice came through the line, steady but urgent. I just spoke with a few workers from the plant. They're scared to speak openly, but one of them said something about shutting down a whistleblower. Someone tried to raise alarms months ago. Frank leaned forward, his interest piqued. Whistleblower? What do you mean? There was a woman, Sarah explained, an older employee. She tried reporting safety violations but was forced out. She's keeping quiet now, fearing for her job. Frank clenched his jaw. The pieces were falling into place. The silence, the cover-up, it was bigger than he imagined. I'm going to meet her, Sarah added. I'll let you know what I find. Frank nodded, even though she couldn't see him. Be careful, Sarah. Meanwhile, at the local diner, Frank found himself a quiet booth. Duke lay in his truck outside, resting but far from healed. Frank ordered black coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. The small town buzzed with normal morning chatter. Farmers talked weather, kids waited for the school bus, and neighbors greeted each other. But Frank's world was spinning out of control. After noon, Sarah arrived at his door, looking more determined than ever. I talked to Linda, she said, handing Frank a notepad filled with scribbled notes. She's the whistleblower. She was a quality control inspector at the plant until about 6 months ago. Frank's eyes scanned the page. She said the plant's been ignoring safety protocols, is disposing of chemicals improperly, started mixing unapproved additives in food products. Frank's fists clenched. That's criminal, Sarah nodded. She's terrified. Frank says people watch her. She's afraid something might happen to her. Frank looked out toward the street, worry creasing his brow. The town might not believe him, but he wouldn't let fear silence the truth. We have to protect her, Frank said firmly. She's a key witness. The next day, Frank and Sarah made their way to Linda's home, a modest house on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. The woman opened the door, her face pale but her eyes sharp. I don't usually talk to strangers, Linda said cautiously, especially not about this. Frank smiled gently. We're just trying to keep Cedar Falls safe. Linda nodded slowly and invited them inside. I worked at the plant for over 10 years, she began. At first, it was a good job. But things changed after Billy Hartwell took over. Production increased, profits soared, but safety went out the window. She pulled out a folder thick with photographs and documents evidence she had secretly collected. These are photos of chemical storage areas, Linda explained. See here. Chemicals stored near food prep areas, leaking drums, and even workers without proper protective gear. Frank studied the images, his heart pounding. Why didn't you go to the authorities? Linda hesitated. I tried, but Billy's got the town in his pocket. The police chief works security at the plant part-time. The mayor's campaign was funded by Hartwell Industries. No one wants to rock the boat. The kid's getting sick. Linda nodded. It started with the workers, then their families. Some kids had unexplained seizures, stomach problems, but nothing was ever linked to the plant officially. Frank's thoughts went back to Duck, the loyal dog who had been suffering in silence. You did the right thing coming forward, Frank said quietly. Linda looked down. I just hope it's not too late. Back in town, word of Frank's concerns was spreading, but not the way he'd hoped. Some people whispered about him behind closed doors, questioning his judgment. Poor old Frank's losing it, an old neighbor told another. Too many years on the force, too many ghosts. Frank knew it was coming. The price you pay for speaking uncomfortable truths in a small town. One afternoon, Chief Walt Bradley came to Frank's door. Frank hadn't spoken to him since retiring, and the tension was thick. Frank, we need to talk, Bradley said, his tone firm but not unkind. Inside, the two men faced each other across the kitchen table. Chief, I need your help, Frank. said, his voice steady despite the storm inside. "This plant is poisoning my dog. It could poison this whole town." Bradley sighed. "Frank, I respect what you've done for this community, but you need to be careful. People are nervous. Accusations like this can tear a town apart." Frank's eyes hardened. "So what? We stay silent and wait for more people to get sick." Bradley looked away for a moment. "Billy's got influence. He's a big employer. People depend on that plant." Frank leaned forward. "People depend on clean food and water, too." Bradley nodded slowly. "I'm torn, Frank. I want to believe you, but I need evidence that can stand up in court." Frank clenched his fists. "I'm working on it." That night, Frank sat on his porch with Duke. The dog was weaker than ever, but his eyes still held that fierce intelligence. Frank whispered, "Hang on, boy. We're going to figure this out." Suddenly, Duke's ears perked up, and he let out a low, urgent whine. Frank looked toward the darkening street. A sleek black car rolled slowly past the house. The windows were tinted, but Frank caught a glimpse of a familiar face inside. Billy Hartwell. Frank's heart pounded. The man who controlled the town was watching him now. In the following days, Sarah's investigation gained traction. She uncovered documents showing that Billy's company had been fined repeatedly for safety violations in other states. But the fines were quietly paid and no serious action was taken. She also discovered that some medical reports on the local children's illnesses had been altered or buried. Frank's calls to state and federal agencies went unanswered or were delayed. It was a battle against a system designed to protect power and silence the vulnerable. But Frank had one advantage. Duke, the dog, despite his suffering, continued to lead Frank back to the plant, insisting something there was wrong. One evening, as Frank and Sarah watched from a distance, Duke's behavior changed suddenly. The dog began barking furiously at a delivery truck backed up to the loading dock. Workers moved hurriedly, their faces tense. Frank felt a chill. Something was happening, something they weren't ready for. He looked at Sarah. "This isn't just about the plant anymore. It's about protecting this town from something we haven't even seen yet." Sarah nodded, gripping her camera tightly together. They prepared to expose a truth that some wanted buried forever. The cold autumn wind rattled the branches of the maple tree outside Frank Sullivan's window, its leaves swirling like memories caught in a restless dance. Inside, Frank sat alone in his living room, the soft hum of the television barely filling the silence that had settled over the house since Mary's passing. His gaze drifted to an old photograph on the mantelpiece, a younger Frank smiling. Beside a teenage boy with dark hair and haunted eyes, Billy Tiod, he had been just a boy then, barely 15, scared and bruised. Frank's wife Mary had insisted they take Billy in when the foster system failed him. For a time, the boy had found a semblance of safety under their roof, a place where he could try to be a kid again. But the world had a way of catching up, and Billy had slipped through their fingers. Swallowed by the cold, uncaring machinery of the system, Frank reached out and touched the photograph, his fingers tracing the outline of the boy he once knew. Flashbacks flooded Frank's mind, sharp and raw. It was a chilly October evening in 1994. Frank, then a young patrol officer, had been called to a domestic disturbance on the rough side of town. The house was a rental with peeling paint and an unkempt yard littered with broken toys and debris. Neighbors had reported screaming, not the usual argument, but something darker. Inside, Frank had found Billy standing in the kitchen, clutching a battered baseball bat. The boy's arms were covered in bruises, the twisted fingerprints of a man who was supposed to protect him, but had instead made him a prisoner of fear. Frank remembered the weight of that moment, his hand resting on his service weapon but never drawing it. "Put the bat down, son," he had said softly. "Nobody needs to get hurt." Billy's father, a man with bloodshot eyes and a sneer, had turned toward Frank. "Mind your own damn business, pig. This is family." Frank's heart had clenched. The kitchen was a war zone, dishes smashed, blood staining the linoleum. That night, Frank had taken Billy away from the chaos and into what he hoped would be a better life. After months of visits and paperwork, Billy became a fixture in the Sullivan household. Mary baked extra cookies, set an extra place at the table. They gave Billy a key, told him he had a home whenever he needed it. "He's got pain in his eyes." Buddy Mary had said one evening as she watched Billy help Frank fix their old pickup truck, but love can heal that. Love and time. For a while, it seemed like Billy was going to be okay, but the system had other plans. The call came one afternoon that broke Frank's heart. Billy had been placed with a foster family in Kansas City, the Hendersons, a wealthy couple with connections and resources Cedar Falls couldn't offer. Frank and Mary had hoped it was a chance for Billy to have a future, a better life, but the boy didn't see it that way. "Why can't I stay with you and Mrs. Sullivan?" Billy had asked, tears streaming down his face, sitting on their front porch with Duke asleep at his feet. "I don't want to go to strangers. You're my family now." Frank had held the boy close and said what he believed to be true. "Son, sometimes life ain't fair, but you gotta make the best of it. That family can give you things Mary and I never could." Billy's sobs had echoed through the night. "I don't want success. I want to stay," Mary cried for days after. Billy left. She kept his room ready, bought Christmas presents that never got opened. Letters were sent, none returned. The silence grew like a wound. Back in the present, Frank ran his hand through his graying hair. The man who had been Billy was gone. In his place stood Billy Hartwell, polished, confident. The man who owned the food processing plant at the edge of town. Frank's stomach churned every time he thought of that name. One afternoon, Frank met with Sarah Chen Murphy again. She had news. "I found something," Sarah said, her voice low. "Billy's name isn't even on the original birth certificate. Turns out, he was the product of an affair. Judge Harold Morrison, your neighbor, isn't his biological father." Frank's eyes widened. "What?" Sarah nodded, and the judge's wife knew, but she kept it secret, said Billy wasn't the judge's son. Frank leaned back, stunned. That explains a lot. Sarah pulled out court records and legal documents. Billy grew up knowing he wasn't really part of the family he loved, and he hid it well. Frank's thoughts drifted to Harold Morrison, the man who had been his neighbor for 20 years, respected, quiet, distant. Later that evening, Frank was on his porch when his phone rang. It was Judge Morrison. "Frank." The man's voice was strained, almost breaking. "We need to talk. It's about Billy." Frank felt a chill run down his spine. "I'm listening." At Miller's Pond, a quiet spot on the edge of town, Frank found the judge sitting alone on a picnic bench, looking years older than his age. Harold didn't look up as Frank approached. "I feel terrible," he said, voice shaking. Frank sat. Beside him, the air thick with unspoken truths. "I need to tell you something I should have told you 30 years ago." Harold said finally, "Billy ... wasn't my son." The words hit Frank like a punch to the gut. Harold continued, voice barely above a whisper. "My late wife had an affair. Billy was the result." Frank struggled to absorb the revelation. Harold's eyes were haunted. "When you brought Billy to the authorities that night, I saw an opportunity. I thought maybe I could love him, but I never did. I was too angry, too broken." Frank's heart ached. "There were bruises, yes," Harold admitted, "but not. From me, he defended himself against other kids who knew his secret." Frank sat in silence, the weight of years pressing down on him. Harold's voice broke again. "I even recommended the Hendersons for foster care. I thought it was best, but I didn't know. I didn't know what they were. Some died. Billy survived, ... but he was broken." Frank's mind raced back to the boy who once sat on his porch, with tears in his eyes. "I'm sorry," Harold whispered. "I can't live with it anymore." Frank looked down at his hands. The years had been hard, but the truth was harder. That night, Frank sat with Duke on the porch, the dogs breathing shallow but eyes still alert. Frank whispered, "What happened to you, Billy, and why won't anyone talk about it?" Duke whimpered, softly, pressing his head against Frank's leg. In 2 days, 10,000 families would gather for the Harvest Festival, eager for free food and community. But Duke knew the truth, and he was willing to sacrifice everything to warn them. The air was thick with the promise of an early October evening. But inside Frank Sullivan's small living room, the weight of what was coming pressed down heavier than any storm. The Harvest Festival was just 2 days away. 10,000 families would flood the town park, eager for free food, community, and celebration. But Frank knew something dark was lurking beneath the cheerful surface. Duke lay on the floor beside him, eyes tired but alert, his breathing shallow. And now, the chilling details Judge Harold Morrison had shared. The pain Billy Hartwell had carried for decades was no secret anymore, but the question remained: what was Billy planning? Frank rubbed his hands over his face and looked at the calendar pinned to the wall. Just 48 hours. That was all the time left to stop what could be a disaster. Meanwhile, at the Cedar Falls Police Department, Chief Walt Bradley was growing increasingly uneasy. He had tried to stay neutral to balance the town's interests with Frank's warnings. But every day, more evidence trickled in: anonymous tips, unexplained illnesses, and now a missing whistleblower, Linda, the former quality control inspector, had vanished without a trace. A week ago, she'd told Sarah Chen Murphy about the hazardous conditions at the plant and the cover-ups. Now, she was nowhere to be found. Frank paced the station's waiting area. Sarah said over the phone, voice low but determined, "I've been digging into the hospital records. More kids have been admitted with severe stomach issues and neurological symptoms. The doctors suspect heavy metal poisoning, but no one's connecting the dots publicly." Frank clenched his jaw. If only people would listen. That evening, Frank met with Sarah and Maggie at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. Maggie had just returned from a visit with Duke's vet specialists at the University of Missouri. They were working on a treatment plan, but Duke's condition was critical. "He's hanging on," Maggie said softly, "but the toxins have already done damage. The longer this goes on, the harder it'll be to save him." Frank nodded grimly. "And the town," Maggie sighed. "Without intervention, more families will suffer." Sarah pulled out her laptop and opened a series of photos and videos. "I caught this last night near the plant. You can see workers loading boxes marked festival samples onto trucks. What worries me is the way they're handling some of the containers. There's a nervousness in the air." Frank leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "Who's in charge over there?" "Billy Hartwell," Sarah said, "and his security team. They've been watching anyone who asks too many questions. We need to find hard proof before the festival. Otherwise, nothing will stop Billy's plan." At home, Frank sat beside, protective, unyielding. "Hang in there, boy," Frank whispered. "You're the only one who sees this, and I won't let you down." Duke winced softly, pressing his head against Frank's leg, as if offering silent encouragement. The following morning, Frank received an unexpected call. It was Judge Harold. "Morrison, I have something for you," the judge said, his voice strained. "Documents, evidence I've kept hidden for years. I want you to have them." Frank agreed to meet him at a secluded spot near Miller's Pond. When Harold arrived, his face was pale, eyes weary. He handed over a thick envelope filled with court documents, foster care files, and medical reports. "These show what really happened with Billy in Kansas City," Harold said quietly. "The abuse, the cover-ups, photos of bruises, hospital reports, police statements, all ignored or buried. We can't let this happen here," Frank said. Harold nodded slowly. Back at the plant, Billy Hartwell was preparing for the festival with a cold precision. His polished smile hid the storm inside him. Decades-old rage turned into a dangerous plan. Walked among his workers, giving orders and overseeing the packing of the 10,000 boxes of free samples. But in his mind, the plan was bigger than Cedar Falls. This was just the opening act. The food was laced with chemicals that would make the town sick slowly, invisibly, and soon the water supply would be next. Billy had spent years building his empire, and now he was ready to unleash his final lesson, to make the town understand helplessness. That afternoon, Frank and Sarah went to the Cedar Falls Harvest Festival site to observe the preparations. Rows of tents were being set up, tables stacked with boxes bearing the town's emblem. Parents brought their children, smiling and excited. Unaware of the danger looming just out of sight, Frank's chest tightened as he watched the happy faces. He felt the weight of responsibility settle heavier than ever. "We have to stop this," Frank said. Sarah nodded. "But we need more than words. We need proof." As dusk fell, Frank received a chilling message from an anonymous source, a video showing Billy in a late-night meeting, discussing the chemical additives with a lab technician. The audio was faint, but clear enough to hear Billy say, "The concentration is perfect. Symptoms will mimic flu season. We don't want immediate deaths, just fear and control." Frank's hands shook as he watched. "This is it," he whispered. But the fight was far from over. Word of Frank's investigation had reached Billy. The man who had once been a scared, broken boy was now a predator, willing to do anything to protect his plan. Frank knew the coming days would test every ounce of his strength, loyalty, and faith. And Duke, his faithful partner, was counting on him. The morning sun broke over Cedar Falls, washing the town in a soft golden light that belied the storm brewing beneath the surface. Today was the day the Harvest Festival would kick off, an event the whole town looked forward to. Kids with sticky fingers, parents sharing smiles, neighbors gathering to celebrate the simple joys of community. But for Frank, Sullivan, and Duke, this day carried a weight heavier than any holiday. Frank sat in his truck across from the park, watching as festival workers in crisp uniforms unloaded box after box marked festival samples. Volunteers moved swiftly, their smiles warm but a little too practiced, as if hiding the tension beneath. Duke lay in the passenger seat, his breathing shallow and labored, but the dog's spirit was unbroken. Despite it all, Duke's eyes burned with a fierce determination that seemed to say, "This isn't over." Frank's fingers tightened around the steering wheel as he scanned the crowd. Families streamed into the park, children chasing bubbles, couples setting up picnic blankets, unaware of the danger lurking within those seemingly harmless boxes. He glanced down at Duke, his faithful partner, his heart aching. "We've got to stop this, buddy," Frank whispered. "But how?" Suddenly, Duke lifted his head, ears twitching as a low growl rumbled from deep within his chest. Frank looked toward the source of the sound at the main distribution table, Duke's eyes fixed on a man moving through the crowd. Billy Hartwell, the polished businessman who owned the food plant, the man Frank once knew as a scared boy, lost in a broken system, sharp and urgent. Drawing startled glances, Frank opened the door and stepped out of the truck, calling softly, "Easy, boy." But Duke's bark echoed again, louder this time, drawing the attention of festival-goers. He lunged toward the tables, knocking over a box of crackers. Packages spilled onto the grass, some torn open. Frank rushed forward to steady Duke Hart. "Pounding dot," the crowd murmured. Confusion rippling through the happy scene. His eyes flicked to Duke, then to Frank, and something cold passed between them. Frank stepped forward, raising his voice so all could hear. "There's something wrong with these samples." Whispers turned to murmurs. Billy's face hardened. "That dog is sick, probably old age." "There's nothing wrong with our products. These accusations are baseless." Frank met his gaze. "Duke's been poisoned by the same chemicals you're putting in the food. He's been warning us, even when it was killing him." The crowd's eyes shifted between the two men. Some faces showed doubt, others concern. At that moment, Sarah Chen Murphy stepped forward, laptop in hand. "I have something to show you," she said, voice steady. She pressed play on a video recording she'd captured the night before. Billy, in a heated discussion with a lab technician. The audio was grainy, but the words cut clear. "The concentration is perfect. Symptoms will mimic flu season. It's not about immediate deaths. It's about control, fear." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Billy's face twisted with anger and desperation. "That video is fabricated. A lie. You're all being played." But his voice lacked its usual confidence. Duke collapsed at Frank's feet, his legs buckling as the poison took its final toll. Frank dropped to his knees, cradling the dog's head in his lap. "It's okay, boy," he whispered, tears streaming. "You did it. You saved them." Parents gathered, some crying quietly, others holding their children close. Children asked questions their parents struggled to answer. The truth was out. Billy retreated, pushing through the crowd toward his sleek black Mercedes, his eyes wild, filled with panic and rage. "You don't understand," he screamed. "You don't know what it's like to be broken, to be helpless." Frank looked down at Duke, the dog's eyes still focused, still fighting. "Walt," Frank whispered to Chief Bradley. Breathing grew more labored, his body weakening with every passing second. Frank whispered stories of better days of Mary, of their early years, of the boy who became the man standing just out of reach. In the days that followed, the town grappled with the reality of what had nearly happened. The contaminated food was recalled. Investigations uncovered a network of corruption shielding Billy's operation. Families rallied to support those affected. Sarah's reporting 1. national attention, shining a light on the dangers of complacency and the power of courage. Meanwhile, Duke lay in a quiet corner of the vet clinic, his body battered but his spirit unbroken. Against the odds, he was alive. Frank visited daily, bringing him favorite treats and soft words. "You're a fighter, buddy," Frank said, stroking the dog's fur, "just like you always were." Billy's arrest sent shockwaves through Cedar Falls. The man who had once been a frightened and in the unyielding loyalty of a dog who refused to give up. One afternoon, Frank sat on his porch, Duke beside him, watching children play in the yard. The old dog chased a tennis ball slowly, but with joy. Mary's voice echoed in Frank's memory. "Love finds a way." Frank smiled through tears. For the first time in a long while, he felt peace. The sun was beginning to dip low over Cedar Falls, casting long shadows across the quiet streets, but Frank Sullivan's mind was anything but calm. The chaos of the Harvest Festival still echoed in his ears. The panic, the rush to contain the contaminated food, and the harrowing chase after Billy Hartwell. Even with Billy behind bars, Frank knew the fight was far from over. That evening, Frank sat in his dimly lit living room, Duke resting beside him. The dog's breathing was still labored, his body frail but his eyes sharp as ever. Frank reached out and stroked Duke's graying fur, drawing strength from his loyal companion. The phone rang, jolting Frank from his thoughts. Frank said, Sarah Chen Murphy's voice, steady but urgent, "I just got word from the state police. Billy's car was found abandoned 3 miles south of town. He's on foot." Frank's heart pounded. Billy was loose. "Any leads?" Frank asked. "Nothing." "Solid, but I have something else. You need to see this." Minutes later, Sarah arrived at Frank's house, carrying her laptop and a bundle of papers. "I've been tracking Billy's movements through surveillance footage from nearby towns," she explained. "There's something strange about his route." Frank leaned over as Sarah pulled up video clips showing Billy moving stealthily through wooded areas and rural roads. "He's heading toward the town's water tower," Sarah said. The primary source of Cedar Falls' water supply. Frank's stomach turned. The water tower, if Billy managed to contaminate that, the entire town would be at risk. The next morning, Frank and Chief Walt Bradley convened an emergency. Meeting with state environmental officials and law enforcement, "We need to secure the water treatment plant and the tower. If Billy gets there first, the fallout could be catastrophic." Bradley nodded grimly. "We've got officers stationed along all major access points. No one in or out without clearance." Frank glanced at Duke, who stirred weakly but gave a determined look. "We'll need Duke," Frank said softly. "He's got a nose no one else has." As the task force mobilized, Frank prepared for the worst. Duke's condition was critical. Cedar Falls, the sprawling facility. It was heavily guarded, but Frank's team was ready. When they arrived, Frank's heart sank. The main gate had been cut open. The security guard was nowhere to be found. "Billy's been here," his eyes scanning the area inside the plant. Billy was already at work. A large duffel bag sat open beside the main water tank, filled with containers of industrial chemicals, the same toxins found in Duke's blood and the contaminated food. Billy's expression was eerily calm as he prepared to dump the deadly mixture into the water supply. Frank and his team moved in cautiously, their weapons drawn but ready for restraint. Billy looked up, meeting Frank's gaze with a cold intensity. "You're too late," Billy said quietly. "The poison's already in the system. In 6 hours, every tap in Cedar Falls will flow with the same cocktail that's been killing my dog." Frank's fists clenched. "Billy," Frank said firmly, "this isn't you. You're better than this. You don't know me, Frank. You never did. I'm the product of broken promises, broken families, and broken lives." Outside, Duke whimpered, sensing the danger. Frank knelt beside him, stroking his head. "You're going to help me stop this, boy, one last time." Inside the plant, tension mounted, Billy lifted a container, ready to pour suddenly. Duke stirred with surprising strength, struggling to stand. Despite the poison ravaging his body, he let out a sharp bark, a warning that echoed through the plant's metal walls. Billy's eyes flicked toward the sound. Frank seized the moment. "Step away from the chemicals." "Billy, it's not too late to stop this." Billy hesitated, his hands trembling. But then the mask slipped. and the broken boy beneath the man's facade surfaced. "I don't know how to stop," Billy whispered. "I don't know how to be anything but broken." At that moment, Chief Bradley stepped forward, his weapon drawn but steady. "Billy Hartwell, you're under arrest." Billy's eyes darted wildly. For a heartbeat, it seemed he might surrender. But then, with a cry of anguish, he lunged toward the tank. A single gunshot rang out. Billy collapsed to the floor, the container slipping from his hands. The chemicals spilled harmlessly on the concrete away from the water source. Frank rushed to Duke's side, cradling the dog's head as his breathing grew shallow. "It's over, buddy," Frank whispered, tears streaming. "You did it. You saved us all." The room was silent except for Duke's labored breaths in the days that followed. Cedar Falls began to heal. The contaminated food was removed, the water tested and purified. Families came together, supporting one another through the aftermath. Sarah's reporting won accolades, shining a light on the courage it took to stand up to darkness. Duke's recovery was slow but steady. The toxins had left scars, but the dog's spirit was unbroken. Frank visited daily, bringing comfort and hope. "Rest. Easy, old friend," Frank said softly. "You're a hero." Billy Hartwell's legacy was a painful one, a reminder of what happens when brokenness is left unchecked. But for Cedar Falls, it was also a story of resilience, of a town that refused to give in, and of a dog who never stopped fighting. The late afternoon sunbathed Cedar Falls in a warm golden glow, softening the edges of a town that had just survived a storm no one could have seen coming. The harvest festival was over, the park emptied of families and laughter. But the scars of what had almost happened lingered in the hearts of everyone who called this place home. Frank Sullivan sat on his front porch, the worn wooden boards creaking beneath him as he leaned back in his chair. Duke, his faithful German shepherd, lay nearby, chasing a well-worn tennis ball with slow, careful movements. The vet had said Duke would never be the same, that the poison coursing through his veins had left lasting damage, but the dog's spirit was alive and strong. Mary's voice echoed softly in Frank's memory, her words a soothing balm. "Love finds a way." Frank smiled through the tears. Love had found a way through pain, through fear, through betrayal. The days since Billy Hartwell's arrest had been a whirlwind. The federal investigation unearthed decades of deceit and abuse. The food processing plant was permanently shut down, and the town's water system was thoroughly tested and purified. Families affected by the contamination rallied together, raising money for medical bills and supporting one another through recovery. Community centers held meetings, schools educated children about safety and trust. Sarah Chen Murphy stayed in Cedar Falls, committed to helping the town rebuild. Her reporting had won national acclaim, but more importantly, she had become a voice. For the people, a reminder that courage could change lives. Frank often found himself at Sarah's side, working together to ensure the truth remained at the forefront. One afternoon, as Frank watched Duke lazily chase a ball in the yard, his son Michael came up the porch steps, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Dad, you're going to spoil that dog." "Rotten," Michael said with a smile. Frank laughed. "Duke's earned it." Michael settled beside him, glancing toward the yard. "You know this town's changed. What happened?" "It brought people together in a way nothing else could." Frank nodded. "It's been a hard lesson, but sometimes that's what it takes." Duke wandered over to Emma, Sarah's daughter, who was playing nearby. The little girl knelt down, whispering secrets into Duke's ear. The bond between them was palpable, a healing connection born from shared struggle. Frank watched with a full heart. For the first time since Mary's death, he felt peace. Reflecting on everything, Frank knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The damage was real, and recovery took time. But the town's resilience, the strength of its people, and the loyalty of a dog who refused to give up had changed the course of Cedar Falls' future. Before the sun dipped below the horizon, Frank stood and looked out over his neighborhood, a place that had seen darkness but refused to be defined by it. He whispered to the fading light, "Thank you, Duke, for everything. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Frank and Duke's story, a tale of loyalty, courage, and the power of love to overcome even the darkest challenges." What's a moment in your life where loyalty and love helped you through a difficult time? Share your stories in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to Heroes for Animals for more inspiring stories of courage, friendship, and hope.